Street.
What's going on there, ma'am?
We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please.
Explain to me what's going on, okay?
There's a note left and our daughter's gone.
A note was left and your daughter is gone? How old is your daughter?
6 years old. She's gone. 6 years old.
How long ago was this?
I don't know. I just found the note. And my daughter's
Does
gone.
it say who took her?
What?
Does it say who took her?
I don't know. There's a ransom note here.
It's a ransom note?
It says SBTC. Victory. Please.
Okay, what's your name? Are you
Kathy Ramsey, I'm the mother. Oh my God. Please.
Okay, I'm sending an officer over, okay? Do you know how long she's been
No,
gone?
I don't. Please, we just got out. Is she right here? Oh my God, please.
Okay,
Please, somebody.
I am, honey.
Please.
Take a deep breath away, okay?
Hurry, hurry, hurry.
Kathy, 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 Kathy.
The 911 call, vocal stress analysis, and background sounds. We've traced microscopic fibers and examined blankets that spoke of care within staging. We've descended into wine cellars and walked through timelines that biology contradicted. And now we need to pause at something that exists in a different dimension of evidence, not physical traces that forensic laboratories can analyze under microscopes, not locations that reveal geographic knowledge, but sound, recorded sound, the preservation of human voice in moments of crisis, captured by technology and available for examination decades after the breath that created those sounds has long passed. We need to think about the 911 call, those minutes of audio that should provide the clearest window into a mother's state of mind upon discovering her child missing, into genuine panic and fear, into the authentic response to unbearable discovery. Because here's what sits quietly in that recording, waiting for those who listen carefully. Layers of complexity that resist simple interpretation, moments where voice and content seem to diverge, sounds in the background that have sparked decades of debate about what was said and who was present, and whether the call ended when it seemed to end, or whether something continued after the phone was believed to be disconnected. Let's establish what we understand about vocal stress and authentic emotional response before we begin to analyze what the recording preserves. From a physiological perspective, genuine panic creates specific patterns in human voice. The autonomic nervous system floods the body with stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, preparing for fight or flight response. This activation affects the voice in measurable ways. Pitch rises as tension increases in vocal cords. Breathing becomes rapid and shallow, affecting speech patterns. Voice quality changes as stress impacts fine motor control of the vocal apparatus. These physiological responses happen automatically, below conscious control. We cannot fake them perfectly even when we're trying to perform emotions we don't actually feel. And trained analysts can often detect the signatures of genuine distress versus performed distress by examining the acoustic properties of recorded voice, looking for the patterns that physiology creates when autonomic activation is real versus when someone is attempting to sound distressed without the underlying physiological state that genuine crisis creates. Theme 1. The architecture of distress. What voice reveals about state. When we listen to the 911 call, when we attend not just to the words being spoken, but to how those words are delivered, we're listening for signatures of genuine crisis response. From a psychological perspective, people in authentic panic typically show specific patterns. Speech is fragmented, thoughts don't connect smoothly. There's often confusion about sequence of events. Sometimes inability to answer simple questions, because cognitive resources are overwhelmed by the crisis at hand. The voice carries this cognitive overwhelm. It trembles, it breaks, it shifts between controlled attempts at communication and moments where control shatters under the weight of emotion. And these patterns happen naturally, automatically, without the person having to think about how to sound panicked, because they are panicked, because their nervous system is in genuine crisis mode that affects everything about how they speak and what they're able to articulate in the moment. Let's think about what analysts have noted when examining Patsy's voice during that call. From a forensic perspective, some who have studied the recording note elements that align with genuine distress, the crying, the apparent difficulty speaking at times, the communication of urgency to the dispatcher. But others note elements that create questions, moments where vocal control seems more intact than we might expect in genuine panic, places where the emotional presentation seems to shift in ways that don't quite align with how uncontrolled emotional states typically manifest, patterns that some analysts interpret as suggesting performance rather than authentic experience. Not definitive proof of anything, voice analysis exists in interpretive space, where experts can disagree about what patterns mean, but creating questions nonetheless about whether what we're hearing reflects someone discovering terrible news in the moment or someone performing discovery for the benefit of recording and investigation that would follow. From an anthropological lens, we need to understand that cultural and individual factors shape how people express distress. Some people become very vocal in crisis, others become quiet and controlled. Some people's voices break easily under stress, others maintain remarkable composure even in genuine panic. So we cannot simply say that any particular pattern definitively indicates authenticity or performance. What we can do is examine whether the patterns we observe align with what we would expect given the specific circumstances. A mother discovering her child missing, processing that discovery while simultaneously communicating with emergency services, operating under whatever combination of genuine panic and need to convey information was shaping her state in those moments. And when we examine this alignment, when we ask whether the voice patterns match what the circumstances would predict, we find areas of consonance, but also areas where questions emerge about whether all elements align as seamlessly as they would if the discovery were entirely as presented. Now let's consider what the content of what was said reveals alongside how it was said. From a psychological perspective, people in genuine crisis often struggle to stay on task, to answer questions directly, to provide information in organized ways, because their cognitive resources are overwhelmed by the crisis itself. But Patsy's communication during the call shows moments of remarkable clarity, providing address, articulating what was needed, maintaining enough composure to convey essential information despite the supposed discovery just occurring. From a criminological standpoint, this doesn't necessarily indicate anything problematic. Some people maintain impressive functional capacity even in crisis, but it creates tension with other elements. If cognitive capacity was sufficient for clear communication, why were certain basic questions about the child's status or circumstances apparently more difficult to address? The pattern of what was articulated clearly versus what was articulated with apparent difficulty doesn't quite match what we might predict if the entire response was genuine discovery rather than managed performance of discovery. Let's shift to thinking about timing and what it reveals about the call's placement in the sequence of events. From a physiological perspective, the autonomic activation that genuine panic creates doesn't just appear. It builds over seconds or minutes as the brain processes what's being confronted. So if Patsy had just discovered the note, just read its contents, just processed that her child was supposedly kidnapped, we would expect the call to occur either during the peak of that autonomic response, voice reflecting maximum distress, or after some minutes had passed for initial shock to begin receding. What we hear in the recording needs to align with one of these temporal windows. And when analysts examine the vocal patterns, when they try to place where in the panic response curve Patsy seems to be based on the acoustic properties of her voice, some note that the patterns don't quite match either extreme. Not the peak chaos of immediate discovery, not the beginning to stabilize quality of several minutes past discovery, but something in between that creates questions about when the note was actually found relative to when the call was made. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask, what does it mean if the call was performed rather than spontaneous? It would mean that by the time 911 was dialed, by the time that recording began capturing voice and background sounds, some period of time had already passed. Time for initial discovery and response. Time for decisions to be made about what would be reported and how it would be reported. Time for the terrible staging we've examined to reach the point where external notification became necessary. The call in this reading wouldn't represent the moment of discovery, but a later moment when discovery had to be performed for outside authorities, when the narrative constructed during prior hours needed to be voiced, when the apparatus of investigation needed to be initiated because delay could no longer be sustained without creating suspicions worse than what immediate reporting would create. This doesn't make the call insincere in every dimension. Genuine grief can coexist with performed discovery. Real distress about circumstances can coexist with awareness that the version being communicated isn't precisely what occurred, but it transforms our understanding of what the call represents in the timeline. From a criminological standpoint, examining 911 calls for authenticity is standard investigative practice. Dispatchers are trained to listen not just to content, but to effect, to notice when vocal presentation and circumstances don't quite align, to flag calls that seem unusual for follow-up investigation. And the dispatcher who took Patsy's call apparently did note elements that seemed unusual, not necessarily indicating anything definitive, but creating enough questions that the call received attention beyond routine processing. This doesn't prove the call was inauthentic, but it means that even in the moment, even before any analysis of recordings or investigation into circumstances, something about the call, registered as not quite aligning with typical patterns of mothers discovering children missing, suggesting that the questions analysts would later raise about the call's authenticity had some basis in the immediate impression it created with trained emergency personnel. So when we step back and consider the architecture of distress, what voice reveals about state, how acoustic patterns either align with or diverge from genuine panic, what timing tells us about when discovery actually occurred relative to when reporting occurred, what trained listeners noted even in the moment. We're looking at another thread in the pattern we've been building. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the 911 call creates questions about authenticity, about whether what we're hearing represents spontaneous response to genuine discovery, or whether we're hearing performance of discovery for benefit of recording and coming investigation, not proof of staging in isolation, but one more element that refuses to sit comfortably in the official narrative, one more detail that creates tension between what we're told occurred and what examination of evidence suggests might actually have occurred. One more voice, this time literally, whispering that the timeline and sequence we've been given might not reflect when things actually happened, but rather when they were reported to have happened after hours of other activity had already transpired in that house. Theme 2, the background whispers, what happens after disconnect. We've examined the call itself and what vocal patterns might reveal, and now we need to descend into something more controversial, more disputed, more laden with interpretive complexity than even the voice analysis. We need to think about what happened after the call supposedly ended, about sounds captured in those final seconds of the recording, about whether conversation continued beyond the point where Patsy believed she had disconnected, and about what that conversation, if it occurred, might tell us about who was present and what state they were in during those moments when they thought they were no longer being recorded. Because here's what sits in the technical analysis of that recording, what audio experts have debated for decades. Enhanced versions reveal sounds after the apparent disconnect, sounds that some interpret as voices, as conversation, as words being spoken that were never meant to be captured, that exist in that accidental space where technology preserved what participants believed had ceased being recorded. Let's establish what we know about the technical aspects before we dive into interpretation. From a forensic perspective, when someone calls 911, the recording doesn't necessarily stop the instant they press the disconnect button on their phone. There can be delays, technical lags, moments where the line remains open even after the caller believes they've ended the communication. And during those moments, sounds at the call origin continue to be captured, continue to be recorded, continue to be preserved, even though the caller isn't aware they're still transmitting. This isn't unusual. It happens in many emergency calls, creates audio that wasn't intentionally communicated, sometimes preserves sounds or conversations that become significant for understanding circumstances beyond what the formal call content revealed. In this case, that post-disconnect audio has been analyzed extensively, enhanced using various technical methods, and interpreted in ways that create significant controversy about what was said and what it means. From a psychological perspective, what people say and how they behave when they believe they're no longer being observed or recorded can be more revealing than what they say during formal communication. During the call, Patsy was aware she was talking to emergency services, aware her words were being recorded, aware she needed to communicate certain information and maintain certain presentation. But after she believed she had disconnected, whatever conversations or sounds occurred would reflect people operating without that performance consciousness, without awareness that their voices and words were still being captured. This creates potential for the background sounds to be more authentic, more reflective of actual state and circumstances than the formal call content itself. If we could determine what was said in those background seconds, if we could definitively interpret the sounds that enhancement reveals, we might have window into what was actually occurring in that house at that moment versus what was being performed for the dispatcher's benefit. Now let's examine what different analysts have claimed to hear in the enhanced audio. Some hear 3 distinct voices, suggesting Patsy, John, and potentially Burke all present and speaking during those post-disconnect seconds. Some interpret words and phrases that, if accurately heard, would create significant problems for the official narrative that Burke was asleep in his bed and that the parents were in genuine crisis of just discovering their child missing. Others caution that enhancement can create artifacts, that human pattern recognition creates false positives when listening to ambiguous sounds, that what some hear as voices might be noise, static, technical artifacts of the recording and enhancement process. From a forensic perspective, this is exactly the kind of evidence that creates maximum controversy, suggestive enough to seem significant if interpreted one way, ambiguous enough to allow dismissal if interpreted another way, existing in space where expertise and technology haven't yet reached the point of definitive determination. Let's think about what it would mean if the interpretation suggesting 3 voices is accurate. From a criminological perspective, this would indicate Burke was awake and present during the 911 call, contradicting statements that he remained asleep until later. It would indicate some level of conversation or interaction occurring immediately after Patsy thought she had disconnected, suggesting the crisis mode we might expect if parents had just discovered their child missing wasn't as all-consuming as formal call content suggested. It would indicate consciousness about what was being said and to whom, awareness that certain things could be communicated during the recorded call. But other conversations needed to wait for perceived privacy. And it would raise questions about what was being discussed, what needed to be communicated between family members in those moments, what the transition from performed discovery to private family interaction looked like in the seconds after external notification had been accomplished. From an anthropological lens, we need to understand how families communicate in crisis and what conversations occur in moments of privacy versus moments of external interaction. If the background audio does capture family conversation, if there were words spoken when they believed recording had ceased, we're hearing something about family dynamics, about how information was being managed, about whether the crisis was being experienced uniformly by all present, or whether there were differences in awareness, in emotional state, in understanding of what was occurring and what needed to happen next. The tone of those background sounds, the affect audible in whatever voices might be present, could tell us about whether we're hearing people in genuine shock responding to discovery, or whether we're hearing people who had already moved past shock into management mode, discussing practical matters, coordinating responses, operating with consciousness about what came next, rather than being overwhelmed by what had just supposedly been discovered. From a philosophical perspective, we're confronting questions about privacy and evidence, about whether sounds that were never intended to be recorded should be used as evidence, about what it means that technology preserved what participants believed had become private. There are ethical dimensions to analyzing background audio that participants didn't know was being captured. But there are also investigative dimensions if the sounds reveal information relevant to understanding what occurred, if they shed light on timeline or presence or state of consciousness, then examining them becomes not voyeurism, but necessary investigation. The tension sits in recognizing both ethical complexity and evidentiary significance, in understanding that what was accidentally preserved might matter for reconstructing truth, even as we acknowledge the discomfort of analyzing sounds that were never meant to be analyzed. So, when we consider the background whispers, what may or may not have been said after the call supposedly ended, how different analysts have interpreted ambiguous sounds, what it would mean if multiple voices were present and speaking during those seconds, we see another layer of complexity in the 911 call evidence. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the background audio creates questions even as it resists definitive answers. If 3 voices can be identified, if Burke was awake and present, if conversation was occurring about matters that needed privacy, then we have evidence that the state presented during the formal call wasn't the complete picture. That more was happening than was being communicated to emergency services, that the performance of discovery was exactly that, performance, with the real dynamics and consciousness visible only in those accidental seconds when participants believed they were no longer being recorded. The sounds exist. Enhancement reveals something, though what remains disputed, and that dispute itself becomes significant. One more area where evidence creates questions that simple narratives cannot quite address, where what was preserved accidentally might tell more truth than what was communicated intentionally. Theme 3, the weight of the recording. What preservation demands we face. We've examined vocal patterns and background sounds, and now we need to confront what the call's preservation ultimately means for our understanding of that morning. Because unlike testimony that can shift over time, unlike memories that can fade or be reshaped by subsequent events, the recording exists as fixed artifact, preserving those minutes exactly as they occurred, available for analysis by anyone with access to the audio and the willingness to listen carefully. From a forensic perspective, recorded evidence has unique weight precisely because it cannot be amended or adjusted to fit evolving narratives. What was said was said. How it was said cannot be unsaid. And while interpretation of what the recording means can vary, the recording itself remains constant, testifying to whatever state and circumstances existed in that house during those moments when Patsy's voice was being transmitted to emergency services and captured for preservation. Let's think about what it means that this particular piece of evidence has been available for public scrutiny in ways that other evidence hasn't. From an anthropological perspective, the 911 call became one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence, in this case precisely because it was accessible, not locked away in sealed files, not requiring special clearance to examine, but available for anyone interested to listen to analyze, to form opinions about. This public availability created both problems and possibilities. Problems because it allowed speculation and amateur analysis to proliferate alongside professional examination. Possibilities because it prevented the recording from being interpreted solely through official channels, from being shaped entirely by investigative or prosecutorial narratives about what it meant. The call exists in public consciousness in ways that fiber evidence and autopsy findings don't, creating shared experience of the same audio that shapes collective understanding of the case in ways that less accessible evidence cannot. From a psychological standpoint, listening to someone's voice during moments presented as crisis creates particular form of intimacy and judgment. We feel we know something about Patsy through hearing her voice in those moments, through the acoustic and emotional qualities preserved in the recording. But this feeling of knowledge is complicated. We're hearing mediated experience, filtered through phone lines and recording equipment, captured in moments when she was aware of being recorded and thus potentially managing presentation, even in crisis. So, what we think we hear, what we believe the voice reveals about authenticity or performance, might tell us as much about our own expectations about how mothers should sound when discovering children missing, as it tells us about what was actually occurring in Patsy's consciousness during those moments. The recording becomes simultaneously evidence and Rorschach test, revealing as much about listeners' assumptions as about the recorded event itself. Now let's consider what the call reveals about timing and sequence in ways that connect to all the other evidence we've examined. From a criminological perspective, the call establishes a fixed point in time, a moment when external notification occurred, when emergency services were contacted, when the apparatus of investigation was initiated. Everything that happened before the call existed in private family space. Everything after exists in documented investigation space. And understanding what the call represents requires understanding where in the sequence of that night's events it actually falls. If the call represents genuine discovery just occurring, then the timeline is as presented. But if the call represents a later moment when discovery had already occurred, hours earlier, when staging had been completed and external notification could no longer be delayed, then the call's timing tells us something different about what had been happening during the hours between loss and reporting, about what needed to be accomplished before that fixed temporal point when external authorities would become involved and further private management would become impossible. Let's shift to thinking about what the call doesn't contain and what those absences might reveal. From a logical perspective, certain questions the dispatcher asked were answered, but others seemed to create difficulty or weren't addressed as directly as we might expect. Questions about the child's condition, about checking to ensure she wasn't somewhere else in the house, about various practical matters that dispatchers routinely address. These received responses that some analysts note as seeming deflected or managed rather than simply answered. From a psychological standpoint, this might reflect genuine crisis making certain processing difficult. But it might also reflect consciousness about what could safely be said versus what might create problems, awareness that certain questions needed to be avoided or answered carefully because honest answers wouldn't align with the narrative being constructed. The pattern of response and non-response creates one more layer of interpretive complexity in trying to understand what the call represents. From a philosophical perspective, we need to think about what the recording demands we confront about truth and performance, about authentic response and managed presentation, about the space between how people believe they're coming across and how they actually come across when voice and affect are preserved for detailed analysis. The call puts us in the uncomfortable position of judging a mother's response to terrible circumstances, of analyzing voice patterns and emotional presentation in ways that can feel invasive or unfair. But the recording exists. The questions it creates exist. And understanding what occurred that night requires confronting those questions even when confronting them feels uncomfortable, even when we wish we could simply accept the presentation at face value without subjecting it to the kind of scrutiny that recorded evidence enables and that reconstructing truth demands. From a criminological standpoint, the 911 call is typically one of the most important pieces of evidence in cases involving reported crimes or emergencies. It captures state in real time, preserves voices and effects that later testimony might not accurately reflect, creates fixed temporal markers for understanding sequence of events. And in this case, the call has functioned exactly that way, becoming central to debates about what actually occurred, creating questions that have never been satisfactorily resolved about authenticity and timing, and what was really happening in that house during those moments when Patsy's voice was being recorded and preserved for decades of subsequent analysis. The recording stands as testament to those moments, demanding we form understanding not just of what was said, but of what the saying reveals about circumstances, about consciousness, about whether we're hearing genuine discovery or performance of discovery, about whether the fixed temporal point the call creates aligns with the timeline we've been given or suggests earlier discovery, an extended staging period that had to eventually end with notification that could no longer be delayed. So when we consider the weight of the recording, what preservation of voice demands we confront, how public access shaped collective understanding, what timing questions the call creates, what absences might be as revealing as presences, we see the final layer of evidence this particular element provides. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the 911 call refuses simple interpretation. It preserves moments that should clarify, but that instead complicate, that should resolve questions, but that instead create new ones, that should align seamlessly with other evidence, but that instead create tension points where voice and circumstances don't quite synchronize the way we would expect if everything were as presented. The call exists. The voice is preserved. The background sounds, whatever they contain, remain available for analysis. And through all the controversy about interpretation, through all the debate about what the recording actually reveals, one truth persists. We're not hearing the first moments after discovery. We're hearing a later moment, a moment when notification became necessary, a moment that falls somewhere in a sequence of events that began hours earlier when someone found her lost in that basement and faced terrible decisions about what came next. The call is performance, not insincere performance necessarily. Genuine emotion can coexist with performed discovery, but performance nonetheless, preservation of a moment when private management had to become public notification, when family crisis had to be communicated to external authorities, when the voice that would be recorded and analyzed for decades needed to convey discovery that had actually occurred during earlier hours when no recording existed to preserve what genuine discovery in real time would have actually sounded like. We've listened to voice and to silence, to what was said and to what whispers in the background, to performance and to possibility. What emerges isn't certainty about every acoustic detail. Voice analysis and audio enhancement exist in interpretive spaces where expertise can diverge. What emerges is recognition that the 911 call, like every other element we've examined across these 20 chapters, creates questions that refuse simple answers. The voice patterns that some hear as authentic and others hear as performed. The background sounds that might preserve conversation never meant to be captured. The timing that should clarify, but that instead compounds timeline problems we've traced through biology and staging requirements. The call sits in the evidence as testament to a moment when private became public, when family management had to interface with external authority, when performance, however emotionally genuine, had to convey discovery that the accumulated evidence suggests had actually occurred during earlier hours when flashlights bore no prints and practice notes required time and pineapple contradicted sleep, and all the terrible necessities of staging were being accomplished in preparation for this moment when notification could no longer be delayed. 20 chapters, 20 threads of evidence, each creating questions, each refusing comfort, each whispering that what we've been told cannot quite contain what the evidence preserves. And the 911 call, captured and frozen in time, demands we face that disconnect between the timeline presented and the timeline that biology, forensics, geography, psychology, and now voice analysis suggest actually unfolded during the hours when a house that should have been sleeping instead bore witness to circumstances so terrible that decades later we're still listening to recordings, examining microscopic traces, tracing patterns through evidence, trying to understand what really happened during those hours between loss and discovery, between the moment when one child's actions took the life of another, and the moment when parents who faced unbearable choices finally made the call that would preserve their voices, their affects, their performed discovery for all the years of analysis and questioning that would follow.